His name was Thomas Jefferson, one of our most famous founding fathers. He wrote our nation's birth certificate. That's right, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Some people claim other dates, but no, there was no United States of America until July 4th, 1776. But one thing that's been erased and deleted from our history, the Declaration had a list of complaints. It delineated complaints that Jefferson and the founders had with the British King George III. For example, things like denying trial by jury, the requirement to quarter British troops, which meant the British could come and take away your home, your farm, your business, even your church, and use it for the housing of British troops. But also Jefferson, in his original document, complained, are you ready for this? That King George III brought human slavery to our 13 colonies. Have you heard that before? That King George III brought slavery to our 13 colonies. Again, this is the original draft, but why didn't that appear in the final draft, the final version of our Declaration? You know, I grew up that Jefferson wrote this incredible Declaration of Independence, and everybody said, yeah, put my name on there. The old phrase was, put my John Hancock on it. And for the younger people, John Hancock signed it first. He signed at the very top of all the names, in the middle, right in the center, extra large letters. Therefore, that expression, put your John Hancock on there. But the document, I did not realize it was actually argued. It was debated. There were some things that were left in, some that were amended, and others that were completely deleted. And the colonies had to agree. They had to agree on the final version of the Declaration before you would put your name on there. Why? Because when you signed that Declaration of Independence, when you put your name in there, you had essentially signed a death warrant. A death warrant. The Declaration of Independence became a death warrant that the British troops, they had a list of all the names on there by state, and they could go home to home, and with those names they could arrest or imprison you or your family, torture, even kill you, burn down your home, your farm, your business, if your name was on the Declaration, the copies they had. But something else about Jefferson you should know. Here's the man who inspired the whole world with his famous pronouncement that all men are created equal. And he had this profound trilogy of inalienable rights, which are, of course, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But here's the paradox. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote these incredible words, he owned slaves. He owned slaves. He inherited slaves from his father in 1768, 8 years before our Declaration. He acquired more slaves when he got married in 1773, just 3 years before the Declaration. In fact, later on, when Thomas Jefferson became president for 8 years, he owned at least 200 slaves every one of the 8 years that he was president. But the historical records prove the original draft of Thomas Jefferson, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he listed a grievance. He complained that King George III brought slavery to our 13 colonies. Wow. In fact, Thomas Jefferson called slavery, are you ready for this? A violation of the most sacred rights of life and liberty. Do those words sound familiar? A violation of the most sacred rights of life and liberty. Now, I have to interject because something was happened. What could influence in the 1770s, what could have influenced Jefferson and the other founding fathers that could have changed their opinion on slavery? You may have heard me share before. I talk about the three waves of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. These people, these new Christians who said human slavery is a sin, and God told us we must confront that sin. But what else is going on? Because in 1776, human slavery was over 8,000 years old. No, It did not start in 1619. I know some politicians and colleges and universities want to tell you that it started in 1619. It was invented by the United States. That's just a lie, a stinking political lie. In 1776, slavery was 8,000 years old, but it was also big money, and not one country in the whole world had abolished slavery, including the nations of Africa. Not one country in Africa, not one in the whole world, had abolished human slavery. So my thought is that these new Christians of the Great Awakening, did they have an impact on Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers? And as you can imagine, Jefferson's grievance on slavery was one of the most intense debate before we could even adopt our Declaration of Independence. Remember, everyone, including the southern slave colonies, they had to agree. And ultimately, the delegates in Philadelphia to our convention in 1776, they came to agreement. And I have to say again, this sounds self-contradictory. Jefferson, who even when he was president years later, he owned an average of 200 slaves every day that he was president. But in the very beginning, he was going to risk the founding of our country. He was going to risk everything by publicly declaring in a document, in our founding document, in our birth certificate, that slavery was wrong. It was evil. I invite you to go online and read the full original draft. But let me conclude by sharing with you some of the actual comments of Jefferson that were deleted. Jefferson said, he being King George III, he has waged war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. Life and liberty. Do those words sound familiar? And Jefferson continued, life and liberty in the persons of a different people who never offended him. He's talking about the transatlantic African slave trade, the people from Africa. And then Jefferson states, carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. Now, history tells us, and sadly, slavery was a big business, so the accounting was very precise. Over 12 million African slaves were sold at the slave ports of the western coast of Africa. And they were sold by other powerful African tribes. They were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean. That's why it's called the transatlantic slave trade. And the numbers tell us of the 12 million, about 11.2 million survived. About 450,000 went to what is now called the United States. Then it was called North America. About 4.5% went to North America, again now the United States. The other 95% of those 12 million, or the 11.1 million that survived, went to South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. But Jefferson continued. He said that King George was, quote, he capitalized the word Christian, capital C-H-R-I-S-T, all in caps, in his original document, a Christian king of Great Britain, pretty much saying, you call yourself a Christian, but you're dealing in human slavery. Again, this is Jefferson, a slave owner, complaining about the system. This is a great paradox and a wonderful time to go back and look at the proverbial rest of the story. But Jefferson was willing to risk the beginning of our country. If we didn't come to an agreement, there would not be a United States of America. In the very beginning, he complained that King George III brought human slavery to our 13 colonies. So there you go, my friends. Our Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. The southern colonies, the slave colonies, said no, they will not sign this document if you have a complaint about human slavery. I hope this gives you a lot more questions that maybe you'd want to go and look up yourself and see, let me find the original draft of Jefferson. What else did it say? What else was changed? What else was amended or deleted? I hope you enjoyed today's session. And if you did, please hit the like button or subscribe button to let our sponsors and our friends know that Mercer Moments in American History, that we are making a difference. And if you follow my programs, you know I always love to give a shout out to one state. Today it's the state of Virginia. I'm wearing a Virginia hat and shirt. Pray for those young people who love God, who love country, especially in today's politically charged environments. They need our encouragement. They need our prayers. Perhaps my next program will be your state. And I want to close today by reminding us that I believe the strength in America, it's been our faith in values, our faith in God, our values and our amazing worship. Please never forget, in our place called the United States of America, our motto, in God we trust. But let me suggest to you, the strength in America, the reason we're still here after 250 years is because in God we still trust. In God we still trust. Thank you, my friends. God bless you.